So for today's Dhamma discussion, I'm going to be selecting, a sutta, from the Anguttara Nikaya, which is the numerical discourses of the Buddha, and this is actually from, the book of Eights, the eighth book, and this is actually from Sutta number 53. So this sutta itself, the title of it is actually Sankhitta Sutta. Sankhitta is actually a Pali word that actually means brief or very condensed or abridged. And it actually comes from the Pali word, Sankhipati, which means, to shorten or to condense or to abridge or to summarize. So this sutta itself, is actually very, in a way, it's very brief, yet at the same time, it's actually very profound. So the essence of this sutta, actually records, a conversation between the Buddha, the Blessed One, and his aunt. I'm sure you have heard of Mahapajapati Gotami, who actually looked after the Blessed One, after his mother, Queen Maya, passed away, after 7 days after giving birth to the Bodhisattva. And this sutta itself is very interesting, where the Buddha actually explains in brief exactly, what constitutes Dhamma, which is the teaching of the Buddha, and what does not constitute the teaching of the Buddha. And this is actually a very important guidance that's given by the Buddha, especially, in our current Buddhist landscape. You'll find that, the teaching of the Buddha itself has actually, in a way, undergone much evolution ever since, the Blessed One gave the first discourse, more than 2,600 years ago. And of course, we do have, the pristine teaching of the Buddha, which is actually preserved, in the Sutta Pitaka. But nonetheless, when the teachings of the Buddha, are actually taught and being actually explained, or taught in, different countries, they have actually, the teachings themselves have actually been undergone, certain amount of evolution, in that a lot of local customs, and interpretations, have actually been given to the teachings of the Buddha. So much so, you find that in today's Buddhist landscape, we find that it is very much fragmented. If you actually notice, our Buddhist fraternity is very much fragmented, where we find, that they are actually very much different teachings, given by different schools, which gave, different interpretations as to what the Buddha's teaching is. Let me give you some examples. Some actually, for example, teach that, for you to meditate, you just, watch the object come and go. For example, if the kilesas, greed, anger, delusion arises, you just watch it come and go, and you don't actually have to make the effort to uproot, the defilements that have arisen. You just watch it come and go. And some actually teach, for example, that practice of the jhana itself, is the ultimate aim, of our spiritual life. And some teach, for example, that, by just reading the suttas, that itself is already vipassana. And some also teach that in order for you to be a sotapanna, you should actually attend, as many Dhamma talks as possible, and you don't actually have to meditate even to become a sotapanna. So the question now is, we have these divergent views, which are given by different teachings, different schools of Buddhism nowadays, that we find that our Buddhist fraternity is very much fragmented and divided, as to, what exactly, is the true teaching of the Buddha, and what is Buddha Vachana exactly. Because you may say, that, I've actually heard this teaching being taught, by this well-regarded, and well-practiced and respectable monk, and who has had many, many years, of Vasa, and he's highly regarded, so I believe, that's the teaching of the Buddha. In fact, I myself have actually heard this being mentioned by some friends in my Buddhist circle, that I actually, that person, actually placed more confidence, in the teaching, given by her meditation teacher, compared to reading the suttas, because she claims that, the master will actually have more experience and also have more practical knowledge compared to just reading the suttas, which are very much just based on, according to her, it's just based on theories and based on just some very theoretical guidance, given by the Buddha. So that's her view. So we find that nowadays, the Buddhist community itself, we find that, we are very much, in a way, confused, or in a way, we're perplexed, right? By what exactly is the teaching of the Buddha? Because we have got so many of these divergent, teachings, which have actually been taught, very much like going to a supermarket, and you're trying to find your product, but you find that on the shelf there's so many different range of products, with different features, different, different uses and benefits. So you find that it's actually very difficult for you to actually decide what exactly, is the teaching of the Buddha, and that itself is actually very important because you find that if you practice the wrong way, then in actual fact you're barking up the wrong tree, and you also miss the golden opportunity, when the Buddhist Sasana, is very much alive now, and and the true teachings of the Buddha are indeed available, and they are very much preserved, and very much in a way kept, in a pristine form, which actually reflects the early Buddhism or early teachings of the Buddha. So if we don't actually make the effort, to investigate, what the Buddha says, ehi pasiko, for you to actually investigate exactly what true Dhamma is, then you find that you are actually missing out, on a very, very invaluable opportunity for you to learn the Dhamma and also to have the breakthrough, to the Dhamma, for the Dhamma eye to arise, the Dhamma chakku, So if you actually follow the wrong teachings on the wrong path, then that itself, is actually a great waste, and you would have actually lived your life as a human in vain. So, and of course, we all know that for us to understand, and also to ascertain, what exactly the true teaching of the Buddha is. Of course, we know from the suttas, like for example, in DN 16 itself, the Buddha, before the Buddha's, final parinibbana, the Blessed One actually, again and again, in a way reminded the bhikkhus in terms of, how to actually know, what is the teaching of the Buddha and what is not. What is Dhamma and what is not the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One. And, and the Buddha actually made it very clear, in this DN 16, on these last days of the Buddha, before the Buddha's final parinibbana, is that, you must not just, take on in a way, on face value, whatever that, you have learned, whether it is actually from, if you hear someone claims that, for example, I've actually heard this, from the mouth of the Buddha himself, this is definitely Buddha Vachana, and some may actually claim that, I've actually heard this from a community of monks, a Sangha, that this is actually being taught. Or I've actually heard from this elder, who is very accomplished and was well learned, and who actually is well regarded, in the Buddhist community. The Buddha says, that you should not, just accept this, either with approval, or with scorn. Means you should not just the moment you just hear a teaching, that you shouldn't just, just approve it or reject it, but we must always then, make reference back to the suttas, as, and the discourses, as recorded in the Sutta Pitaka, and then check whether it is actually in accordance or in line, what the Buddha has actually taught, for you to, be clear, what exactly, the true teaching of the Buddha is. But of course, this, exhortation by the Blessed One, is more often than not applicable, for members of the monastics who do have the resources, and also they have the interest and the time, for them to actually go deep into the suttas and understand, But how about us lay people, who actually don't have sometimes not the interest, or sometimes you don't have the time or the resources for us to actually understand the suttas or know, every aspect of what the teacher, our great teacher, our Blessed One has actually taught. It is sometimes impossible, because we have worldly duties and responsibilities. So I think that is where, this teaching of this sutta, this AN 8.53, is in fact something that's actually very, important, which it actually records this discussion, between the Buddha, and his aunt, Mahapajapati Gotami, and of course, I'm sure you have heard of this Mahapajapati Gotami, and she was actually featured very much in this sutta, in AN 8.51. Remember, this Mahapajapati Gotami, actually was very much determined, and she made the resolution that she wanted to renounce and become a nun, and then she actually beseeched the Buddha, that she wanted to enter, the monastic, and to train under the Blessed One, and she was actually declined, by the Buddha 3 times, and she didn't give up, and she traveled, all the way from Kapilavatthu to Vesali, and she together with other women who wanted to renounce, and she actually was weeping, and very much exhausted, and with here the sutta says that with her hair shaved, and she was wearing ochre robes, and she was actually waiting outside, for the Buddha, and with crying. She was crying outside, miserable, and like her face was tearful, her limbs were covered with dust, and her feet were swollen, and she beseeched the Buddha, and she was declined again, and Venerable Ananda in the end stepped in, remember, and then she and of course the sutta says that the Venerable Ananda tried to persuade the Buddha by highlighting that this Mahapajapati Gotami has been actually looked after the Bodhisattva when he was young, and gave him much care and love, and because of that the Buddha consented, but subject to 8 rules to be followed by the nun. I think, for example, like all this, that even if a nun has been ordained for 100 years, she has to bow down to a monk who was just ordained on that very day. Even though a monk has been ordained just on that day, this nun actually has to pay respect to this newly ordained monk, and also some other rules, that the nun cannot actually criticize the monks, but monks, can actually criticize the nun. So all these, is to preserve the order itself. And what the Buddha actually mentioned here is that the reason why he actually declined, women, from actually entering the order is because the Buddha, if you read here, the Buddha says, if the women did not enter the monastic the monastic order under the Blessed One, the Dhamma, the true Dhamma, would have actually lasted for 1,000 years. But since the women have actually joined the order, now the true Dhamma will not last long, but will remain only for 500 years. So, and we can see that happening because after 500 years, we find that counterfeit Dhamma has actually surfaced, as you can see from SN 16.13, and that's why I think in the context and considering, what the Buddha actually highlighted, because Mahapajapati Gotami and the other women, actually then entered the order through Dhamma, actually lasted only for 500 years instead of 1,000 years. So that's why I think it becomes very important in this Sutta 8.53, for us to actually understand, and also for us to, in a way, know the benchmark or the yardstick for you to measure, what constitutes true Dhamma and what is not true Dhamma. Especially for us lay people, we don't actually have the which may not have the interest, or the time or the resources for us to actually deep dive, into suttas, So most of the time, we just hear from our teachers or monk teachers or whom we regard, as highly practiced or highly regarded or knowledgeable, and whatever that we hear from such members of the Sangha or monastic order, we just take it as, that must be correct, because this monk is actually so well regarded, so how can it be wrong, how can it be contrary to the Dhamma, right? So this is where, the danger or the warning bell, that the Buddha has given us, that you shouldn't just take everything on face value and just make the assumption that, since this monk is has how many, like 50 or, or many years of vasa, and, he's well regarded, he's actually renowned, and well practiced. Surely that must be the words of the Buddha, Buddha Vachana. But the Buddha has sounded this warning bell to us many a time, even to the monks, on his last days, before Mahaparinibbana, and the Buddha actually highlighted, that you must always refer to the Sutta Pitaka, But for us, in the absence of that, this sutta becomes, very relevant for us to actually, have a benchmark or yardstick to determine or to ascertain, what exactly is the teaching of the, of the Buddha. So as you can see here, this, there was this conversation, where this Mahapajapati Gotami actually asked the Buddha. She says, Bhante, may the Buddha please teach the Dhamma in brief. What I've heard it, I will leave alone, withdrawn, diligent, keen, and resolute. So normally when the Buddha gives a teaching in brief, usually it tends to be very deep, like what the Buddha actually gave this brief teaching to this Bahia. Remember, the Buddha says, what is seen is only seen, what is heard is only heard. What is cognized is only what is cognized. So, when you hear this teaching in brief, usually it's very brief, yet it's very profound, because you must have that spiritual readiness, or the spiritual development in order for you to actually fathom, and understand, what the Buddha was trying to actually teach, So, in this teaching itself, the Buddha actually gave a brief teaching about what constitutes Dhamma, and what constitutes teachings contrary to the Dhamma. So the Buddha says, Gotami, you might know that certain things, certain Dhamma, lead to passion. They lead to passion, and not dispassion. So, for example, you practice something, right? Then, or you actually behave something, behave in a way, and it leads to more passion, raga, rather than dispassion, viraga, and it leads to yoking, means it leads to bondage. It leads to a lot of bondage where you actually cling, and it holds on to you. Yoking means bondage, not to unyoking, and to accumulation, not to dispersal. Means you tend to want to accumulate more, you tend to grasp more, you tend to crave more, you tend to actually, you want to accumulate more and you crave more and you want to then cling more, and to accumulate, and not instead of letting go and dispersal, you tend to cling more to more desires, not fewer, which means when you practice something, it leads to more and more desire instead of fewer and fewer desire, and to lack of contentment, and instead of contentment, you become more discontent, to crowding, not seclusion, means instead of being preferred to be secluded to practice, but you tend to prefer companies, you tend to prefer, a lot of company and, a lot of interactions with others, and it leads to laziness, not energy. It becomes very indolent. You you tend to procrastinate and you become lazy to practice, to being burdensome, which means you demand a lot, and it becomes very, very difficult or burdensome to support you, and not being unburdensome because you have a lot of desires, a lot of requests, a lot of demands, and because all this arises because of what? Because of craving, and craving and also passion, and raga, and raga itself, of course, it is. If you look at it, is actually lobha. Lobha itself has actually a wide range, from just dislike to passion, or desires. That itself is lobha. So if you actually look at this, right, if you were to look at this, in terms of all these teachings that the Buddha taught, where you should refer and check whether if you practice, they lead to all this, right? So if you look at all these items that Buddha listed out, there's a common thread that runs across all this, right? For example, like you say, passion, yoking, bonding, trying to grasp more, to accumulate more desires, lack of contentment. So what is the underlying, thread that runs through it, The underlying thread that runs through is what? Is the defilements, right? The lobha, dosa, moha, right? So that's why here the Buddha gave, a very concise, which is Sankhitta, a very concise and very abridged teaching, like what exactly is teaching, is Dhamma, what is not Dhamma. So anything that you practice that leads to more the emergence and the strengthening of lobha, dosa, moha, and that itself, the Buddha denounces and says, this is not my teaching. Anything that leads to the attenuation or the weakening or becoming lesser and lesser, in terms of your clinging and all this, which means lesser of lobha, dosa, moha, and that itself, the Buddha says, that is the teaching of the Blessed One. So, and of course, the Buddha gave the reverse, that if you anything that leads to dispassion, to unyoking, fewer desires, and the corresponding reverse, of the earlier part about not Dhamma. So, anything that leads to dispassion, to unyoking, and to less desires, and which means anything that leads to less or the weakening of lobha, dosa, moha, that itself, is the teaching of the Blessed One. So it's very concise, yet it's actually very profound, because you just need to then measure, whatever teaching you heard, against these very brief yet profound teaching of the Buddha in terms of whether it leads to lobha, dosa, moha or not. And this AN 8.13, right? There is also a similar brief teaching, given by the Buddha, but this time is actually to a monk, and this was a brief teaching given by the Blessed One to this Venerable Upali, and this Venerable Upali, again, he actually asked the Buddha, it would be good if the Blessed One would teach me the Dhamma in brief, such that having heard the Dhamma, I might, practice, ardently and resolutely. And again, the Buddha gave this teaching in brief, as the yardstick to determine what exactly, is the Dhamma Vinaya and what is actually not the teacher's instructions. And you actually read this, right? It's actually very insightful. It says, based on the qualities which you may know, Buddha says, these qualities do not lead to utter disenchantment, dispassion, to cessation, to calm, direct knowledge and self-awakening, or to unbinding. You may then categorically hold that this is not the Dhamma, this is not the Vinaya, and this is not the teacher's instruction. And you can see here, this sutta itself, bears a great resemblance, to the answer given to Mahapajapati Gotami, in that the true Dhamma itself, the teaching is when practiced leads to disenchantment, which is nibbida, and leads to dispassion, which is viraga, So these two items, are essentially the yardstick for you to determine, whether you are actually on the right track or whether, you have gone off track, whether, it leads to disenchantment and dispassion. But in this sutta itself, the Buddha did not just tell the characteristics of the Dhamma, in terms of what is the teaching, what's not teaching. in addition to saying that, that his Dhamma leads to dispassion and disenchantment, the Buddha added on another aspect to his explanation to say that it leads to direct knowledge, which means this disenchantment and dispassion must be supported by direct knowledge, which is what? Which is wisdom, right? And calm. Calm, means serenity. That's why you have samatha and vipassana, right? The Buddha says it leads to cessation of becoming, which means that it leads to ending of suffering, it leads to cessation, and it leads to calm, samatha, and direct knowledge, which is vipassana, direct knowledge, and to self-awakening or to unbinding, which is nibbana, So you can see here that in this sutta, it actually gave another aspect, another layer of, further understanding, that in addition to nibbida, and also viraga, his teaching, the Buddha's teaching also leads to calm and direct knowledge, samatha and vipassana. So then, of course, the question now that we need to answer is, since this nibbida and viraga, right, are the essence, of the Buddha's teaching. Because if you look at this, the two suttas, the AN 8.53 and the AN 7.79, right, the common denominator is actually what? The teaching leads to disenchantment and dispassion, which is actually nibbida and viraga. So what are the dhammas taught by the Buddha that will lead to this nibbida and viraga, which is disenchantment and dispassion? So to answer that question, we have to refer to this sutta called AN 11.1, where the Buddha actually explained to Venerable Ananda, exactly what is the purpose of observing our Sila, Actually, the Venerable Ananda actually asked the Buddha, what is the purpose of us, observing the Sila? We keep our precepts, our 5 precepts, and we refrain from the 10 unwholesome actions, the ducharita, the 3 by body, 4 by speech, and 3 by mind. What is the purpose of us doing that? Or observing the 8 precepts on Uposatha days? What is the purpose for us to actually have skillful virtues? And the Buddha explains, if you read this sutta, right, this Sila actually leads to what? Leads to freedom from remorse, Because if you don't practice your Sila well, when you meditate, you find that a lot of the unskillful actions you have done or unwholesome actions you have done, will start to well up in you, start to surface in your mind, and you can't actually, in a way, attain that serenity of mind. Before you can even, do vipassana to actually see things as they really are, right? To see the underlying nature of things, you can't even proceed because your mind is actually very agitated because all these unskillful things start to arise in you, and you have remorse that's actually, in a way, like assaulting you. So the Buddha says that's why Sila is so important, freedom from remorse. And freedom from remorse leads to what? Leads to joy, leads to pamoja, And joy leads to what? Leads to rapture, leads to piti, And piti leads to pasadi, which is serenity, And pasadi actually leads to pleasure, which is sukha, And sukha then leads to what? Sukha then leads to concentration, which is samadhi, And samadhi itself leads to what? Samadhi leads to knowledge and vision of things as they really are, which is yatta bhuta yana dasana, right? And yatta bhuta yana dasana, knowledge of vision of things as they really are, then in turn leads to disenchantment, as its purpose, which is nibbida, and disenchantment, like you feel a bit fed up, you feel very weary, that that you feel very tired and you feel very you feel very fed up, and about conditioned existence. And this enchantment itself leads to what? Leads to dispassion, which is viraga. And dispassion itself, then leads to knowledge and vision of release as its reward, which means like vimutti yana, means that you have actually achieved certain level of release. Like for example, that you are now a sotapanna. I know I'm a sotapanna. I've achieved sotapatti. I know I'm a sakadagami. I know because you have this knowledge and vision of release as its reward, because dispassion leads to it. So if you want to then look at this, right, what are the dhammas that will lead to this nibbida and viraga? Everything goes back to what? everything goes back to Sila, Sila, that is the fundamental building block, of of the spiritual life taught by the Blessed One, For you to actually, to progress on the spiritual path taught by the Blessed One, the first fundamental building block is that you must safeguard and observe your Sila, conscientiously and assiduously. Otherwise, there is actually no further development from there, because you can't even achieve any of this freedom from remorse, going down all to samatha, vipassana, and all this. You can't actually attain anything other than that, because, like for example, samatha up to this concentration is samadhi, then you must have this yata bhuta yana dasana, where you actually then need to practice vipassana in order for you to have this knowledge and vision of things as they really are. But being able to do samatha vipassana, you don't even have sila. How are you going to actually progress further from that? The whole spiritual life is ruined because you don't actually have these skillful virtues. So for you to actually attain, practice this nibbida and viraga, which is the Buddha has actually mentioned as the yardstick to determine what is the teaching the Buddha and what is not. You must understand what are the dhammas that lead to this nibbida and viraga, and everything goes back to Sila. And of course, Sila itself, I've actually explained a lot in my previous talks, in terms of importance of Sila. For example, like taking a life leads to short lifespan, stealing leads to loss of wealth, sexual misconduct leads to rivalry and revenge, telling lies leads to being falsely accused, slandering, or divisive speech, you create disharmony by, backbiting and tail-bearing. It leads to breaking of your own friendship. People just suddenly don't want to be friends with you, because you have done this slandering before. And harsh speech leads to an unappealing sound. Either you yourself, your speech is unpleasant, or you keep hearing, unpleasant sound, or, idle chatter, it leads to you hearing the same thing, And drinking of liquor itself, Buddha says, leads to mental derangement, So all these silas, are very important, And as you can see from Iti Vuttaka also, the Buddha says, if you actually want to have a good rebirth, make sure, you guard your virtue or your sila well, Iti Vuttaka 76. And again, in AN 10.177, remember this sutta about Janusoni? The Buddha says, if you do not observe your sila, having abundance of dana does not mitigate the unwholesome results from not observing your sila. Because a lot of people think that, like a lump of salt, if I actually don't observe my sila, but if I do a lot of dana, it will actually dilute, the bad effects of this non-observing of sila. But the Buddha says, no, if you do a lot of dana, but you don't observe sila, you might end up as a pet dog or a pet cat, or a royal elephant or a royal stallion, because of the dana, you actually have the 5 causes of sensual pleasure, but you don't observe sila, you lose your human status, and at best, you are reborn in the animal realm. And of course, in MN 41, again, the Buddha also highlights to the Brahmans of Sala, that the more unwholesome actions you do in the 10, in terms of performing 10 unwholesome actions, 3, 4, 3, you're creating the potential to be reborn, in the woeful plains, in MN 41. And of course, I have also given some discourses before, about dragons, remember, about Naga, about Garuda, remember the huge birds. If you actually look at SN 29, SN 30, the monks actually ask, why is it that some beings are born as dragons, some and born as these Garudas. Dragons are like huge snakes, and these Garudas are basically huge birds, but they're celestial beings, but they are still animals. And the Buddha says the reason why, they have they're celestial beings, yet they are animals, is because they are ambivalent and they do both kinds of deeds, which means they do wholesome and unwholesome deeds together. Sometimes they observe sila, sometimes they don't. They are not very consistent in observing the sila. But if you compare that against the Gandhabas, which the Buddha says actually those who live in fragrant roots, where trees, where there are flowers, These are Gandhabas, and also the cloud devas. The Buddha says that those devas and live on clouds, right? Then the monks ask, why is it that some people, they are actually reborn as, these Gandhabas, which means like three devas, and also devas, they're born in the clouds. Why are they actually celestial beings? Whereas, the Nagas and the Garudas, why are they animals, yet they're celestial beings? Then the Buddha also highlights that those who are actually born as Gandhabas, and cloud devas, they are full-fledged devas, because they do good things by way of body, speech, and mind, which means they're very conscientious in observing the Sila. So you can see here, the Sila itself is very, very important, for you to actually, in determining, your next, next destination, whether it is in the Sugati Bhumi or the Dugati Bhumi, whether it's actually pleasant, unpleasant. It very, very much depends on the Sila, how well you actually observe, your virtues and your morality, and not so much on, how much of dana you do. That does not mitigate, unlike the most people say it's a lump of salt, but that's not the case. So Sila itself is one thing, and Sila itself leads to freedom from remorse. And the importance of this freedom from remorse, you can see, we can see from this Digha Nikaya Sutta number 2. Remember, this King Ajatasattu, remember, the son of this King Bimbisara, who actually murdered his father, to actually ascend to the throne, remember? And he was actually abetted by Devadatta, and he decided to, murder his father, to actually take control of the throne and the kingdom. And this night itself, this King Ajatasattu went to see the Buddha, and the Buddha gave King Ajatasattu, discourses, and about the benefits, of actually living, as a samana under the Buddha, That's why this is called Samanya Pala Sutta, the benefits, of becoming a renunciant, under the Buddha. And after this discourse, of course, King Ajatasattu, he said, Sadhu, Bante, that you've given such a wonderful Dhamma, about benefits, of renunciant. And he actually then confessed to the Buddha, a transgression has overcome me, Lord, in that I was so foolish, so muddle-headed, that so unskilled, as to kill my father, a righteous man, a righteous king, for the sake of sovereign rulership, May the Blessed One please accept this confession of my transgression, so that I may restrain myself in the future. And of course, the Buddha then, accepted his transgression, and his, his confession, and then after he left, and this is what the Buddha says, not long after King Ajatasattu left, right, the Blessed One told the monks, this king is wounded, this king is incapacitated. Had he not killed his father, that righteous man, that righteous king, the dustless, stainless Dhamma eye would have arisen in him as he sat in this very seat tonight. So can you imagine, because he killed his father, this freedom from remorse itself actually prevented him from actually attaining this Dhamma eye. He failed, he missed the chance of becoming a Sotapanna because, he actually killed his father, and because of that, he didn't observe his Sila, and it leads to this remorse, that actually has become a hindrance, to actually attaining Sotapatti. So that's why this freedom from remorse is also something that's actually very important. So as we can see here, the Buddha actually gave this importance about Sila, about freedom from remorse. Then after that, what should we do? We should then actually practice to cultivate, the factors, that support the arising of the jhana, right? Okay, the Buddha actually praises, the development of the jhana, whether it's first, second, or third jhana, and as you can see here, the Buddha, the Buddha in this AN 5.28 itself, he actually, highlights, the importance of this samadhi, the concentration itself, because the Buddha says, that you develop this, these factors that lead to the development, like for example, this piti, sukha, ekagata, and then you have this, these factors of jhana itself. But if you actually look at this Samma Samadhi, right? I just want to highlight something interesting to you. This AN 5.28, the Buddha explains that this Samadhi is not just the four jhanas, but if you actually look at it, the Buddha says there's another fifth factor that actually constitutes right concentration, And here the Buddha says that as furthermore, the monk has this theme of reflection well in hand, well attended to, well considered, well tuned, by means of discernment, means you must develop the wisdom. After you attain the samadhi, the concentration, you must continue to develop the wisdom. The Buddha says this is the fifth development of the five-factored noble right concentration itself. So, and of course, this most people say, samadhi is just the four jhanas. But if you look at it, the Buddha actually highlights the importance of developing this wisdom, which is seeing things as they really are, right? Which is yatha bhuta yana dasana, And if you look at AN 9.36, this yatha bhuta dasana, the Buddha says that once you develop this jhana, you must actually develop and try to contemplate this five aggregates as non-self, as empty, and that which is what the Buddha says, this anatta, which then leads to this sunyata, this emptiness, which is actually what the Buddha actually calls yatha bhuta yana dasana, to see all conditioned things as non-self, which means that it's conditioned, it doesn't have a permanent, unchanging self. Once you actually able to develop, the jhanas, the samadhi, you must continue to actually practice this contemplation of non-self in order for you to have this yatha bhuta yana dasana. Because yatha bhuta yana dasana then leads to what? Leads to disenchantment and also to dispassion, And in order for you to practice this yatha bhuta yana dasana, to see this non-self nature, the Buddha says, you must actually practice three important ways of meditation. The Buddha says one is a signless concentration, one is the undirected concentration, and one is the emptiness concentration, And if you look at this sutta, to actually understand what this signless concentration, which means that you actually practice this three meditation method in order for you to have this yatha bhuta yana dasana, right? So the Buddha says you must practice these three ways in order for you to uproot, this lobha, dosa, moha, and also to then, to abandon, and uproot this ignorance, that is the one that results in us not understanding the Four Noble Truths. So how do you practice this timeless concentration? The Buddha says you don't pay attention to any distinguishing signs, and you don't pay attention to the signs and features, of the sense object that's actually causing the lobha, dosa, moha to arise in you. For example, you hear somebody say something very unpleasant to you, right? The Buddha says that you must practice this signless concentration. Means you actually do not pay attention to the signs and features of this sense object, that actually is causing you, anger or greed, to arise, So you must then have this signless concentration, which is the Unlimito Sutta, as we can see, the signless concentration. And the Buddha also, and of course in SN 21, this Sutta Nipata 2.11, the Buddha also taught his son Rahula, to practice this signless concentration, and you shouldn't pay attention to this. It's a form of samatha practice. You divert your attention from whatever that's causing the anger from it to arise within you. So that is the most important thing. And the second one is you must have this undirected meditation. What is this undirected meditation? Which means the Buddha says you do not direct your mind to the external sense object, but bring it back, and observe your mind, whether there's actually anything that whether lobha, dosa, moha has arisen in you. You go back, you don't direct your mind to the sense object, but bring it back, internally. That's why the Buddha says that the Dhamma is opanyayiko, means leading inwards. You don't focus on what is outside, but bring it inwards, and that is undirected meditation. Just like the Buddha mentions in this Kuma Sutta, the tortoise, right? The Buddha says if this tortoise were to extend the limbs, outside, and the four limbs and the head outside, then the tortoise would have been eaten up, by the jackal. So that's why the Buddha says, you must practice this signless and undirected concentration such that you actually dwell, you have restraint over your eye base, so that you guard your sense base, your sense base, your sense doors, so that these evil, unskillful qualities like lobha, dosa, moha, will not assail you, will not actually then attack you. So you must be like the tortoise. The moment you know that anger has arisen and you or greed, bring yourself in. Don't go out and don't react in a way that you will actually regret later and you create further unwholesome karma, right? Because the moment you hear somebody and you lash out and you scold back, you yourself have committed that. So like what Ajahn Chah says, it's like the chickens are already out of the chicken coop. Means they have already run astray. Means you have not restrained yourself. There's no sense restraint. So for you to practice that samatha, in order for you to then bring this signless concentration, also undirected concentration, the Buddha says that you must be like this tortoise that always bring it back. The moment you see any danger, or lobha dosa moha arising, bring your limb back to the tortoise will bring the limbs back to the shell and keep them safe so that, will not be eaten up by the jackal. So it's like if the moment you actually lash out, then you're like being eaten up like by Mara, because you already reacted in ways that which are unwholesome. So, and how do you then make sure that you know when to draw yourself inwards, the signless and undirected concentration? Just like how does the tortoise know when to draw the limbs in? Means that you have to actually observe, right, whether the jackal is coming, right? So you yourself, you have to make sure you watch your mind, whether there's any lobha, dosa, moha that's arisen in you, or whether there's no lobha, dosa, moha. Just like what the Buddha says in AN 3.105 in this Sankhitta Sutta, right? The Buddha says if you don't guard your mind, then the actions by body, speech, and mind will be unwholesome. The actions will get soggy, and then the actions will be unwholesome, and one's death will not be good. So that's why the Buddha in Dhammapada says everything is mind, by mind is all made. That's why the mind is very important. You must always watch your mind first to see whether any lobha, dosa, moha has arisen in you. Then once you find, draw yourself in. Always make sure that you watch your mind. That's why this Chittanupassana in the 4 establishments of mindfulness is very, very important for you to watch how your mind reacts to the external sense objects. And once you see that there is the lobha, dosa, moha, make sure you draw yourself in just like the tortoise, and don't let yourself out, like chickens coming out from a chicken coop, So that's why the Buddha says, if you can watch your mind constantly, whether there's lobha, dosa, moha, and whether there's no lobha, dosa, moha, you see, the Buddha says, if you can just practice this watching of mind, and make sure you practice this samatha vipassana, you watch your mind, the Buddha says that you actually can achieve arahantship in this very life itself, Just by this watching of mind is so powerful, in this SN 35.153. And of course, after, practicing this signless and undirected concentration, you must, which is samatha, you must go on to practice vipassana. And the Buddha says, for you to practice vipassana, you must contemplate on what? Emptiness, Like what the Buddha actually asked the monks to do in MN 151. When the monks go on Pindabat, the Buddha says, the monks, you have to watch your mind very attentively and closely, whether any lobha, dosa, moha arises in you or not. For example, when you get some food, right? If you like it, then you feel very elated and happy. If you get something that you don't like, you feel very unhappy or frustrated, or you feel very angry. Then why is it that I get this food? So the Buddha says, when you go on Pindabat, you actually have to watch your mind very carefully, whether there's lobha, dosa, moha. And once you see that lobha, dosa, moha has arisen in you, first of all, of course, you must practice the signless and the undirected concentration, but you must also practice emptiness. Means you must watch this lobha, dosa, moha, in terms of emptiness and their non-self. So that itself is actually what the Buddha says, emptiness. That's why these 3 must be practiced, in together, as a whole, So then how do you practice this emptiness meditation, And you can see this from SN 22.122, where Venerable Sariputta says, for you to practice this emptiness meditation, you must observe the 5 aggregates, as non-self, as emptiness. These 5 aggregates that we see, that we have within ourselves, the form, the feelings, the perceptions, the volitional formations, and consciousness, the 5 constituents, these 5 aggregates, right, must actually be or five aggregates subject to clinging must always be observed, in respect of non-self. That's why in SN 22.17, the Buddha actually told the monks that you must always contemplate these five aggregates in terms of non-self. In fact, this contemplation of five aggregates and non-self, as non-self, this Venerable Sariputta says, will actually lead you to progress from Sotapanna, from Sotapatti up to Sakadagami, Anagami, and all the way to Arahantship. This is how powerful this emptiness or non-self, meditation is. So, as what the Buddha says. So, how do you practice this? Contemplating five aggregates as in terms of non-self. In MN 148, the Buddha says you actually contemplate the five aggregates and non-self through the six sense bases. So if you read this MN 148, it's actually a very powerful sutta, and it tells you exactly how to contemplate, the five aggregates in terms of, for example, when you see a sense object, and when the sense object comes into contact with sense base, then consciousness arises. The coming of the three is contact. The contact then arises in feelings, perceptions, and also in terms of feelings, perceptions, and also volitional formations in terms of, whether you feel angry or whatever, right? So you have these six sets of things happening in the six sense bases, also observing the five aggregates through the six sense bases. So that itself, is the Buddha, actually then highlights, for you to practice in order for you to abandon ignorance and for you to see the Four Noble Truths, and to also achieve this Yatta Bhuta Yana Dasana, seeing things as they really are, which lead to nibbida, disenchantment, to dispassion, which is viraga, and that itself, actually then, leads to the knowledge of release, which is vimutti yana, So the sutta is, taught by the Blessed One is so wonderful. Everything, gels, so interweaves, so beautifully, beginning, middle, and end, that you find that everything, comes like a jigsaw puzzle. So when you actually try to understand whether a Dhamma that's taught by a teacher, is in accordance with the Blessed One or not, and you don't have the time or the interest to actually, what do you call that? Rummaging or, going through the pages, of the suttas, the thick suttas, and having to understand a lot of the terms used, And if you don't have the time to actually do that, then, this AN 8.53 itself gives you that very good benchmark and yardstick to ascertain and determine what is Buddha Vachana and what is not Buddha Vachana. What is the teaching of the Buddha? What is not the teaching of the Buddha? That is something that you can actually then tell yourself, does it lead to more passion or dispassion? Does it lead to disenchantment or more desire? Does it lead to accumulation or less accumulation? Or does it lead to ultimately less or more defilements? Lobha, dosa, moha. Does it actually uproot ignorance? So if you ask these questions like a checklist, right, then you can actually tell, whether what a teacher has taught, is actually in accordance with the Dhamma. Especially during this time in the Buddhist community, we have all these different practices of so-called Dhamma, and self-proclaimed true Dhamma, and you have this esoteric Buddhism, and a lot of this, practices based on rites and rituals and all this. And so then you need to then make sure that whatever that you hear from a teacher, even though highly regarded, well-regarded, highly practiced, well-practiced, you must then compare the teaching against these standards or yardstick given by the Buddha to Mahapajapati Gotami in AN 8.53, and that will give you, a very, very clear insight, as to whether, it is in accordance. So you see, the Buddha actually gave a very, very well-structured framework, starting from Sila to freedom from remorse. From the remorse itself, leading to, joy, and joy, leading to, pity, and leading to many other factors, and ultimately, leading to Yatta Bhuta, leading to Samadhi, and Samadhi then leads to Yatta Bhuta Yana Dasana, and then, that itself leads to Nibbida and Viraga, and also Vimutti Yana. So that will actually then tell you, what is the teaching of the Buddha and what is not the teaching of the Buddha. Even, if you don't have the time to refer to suttas, at least, that will give you, the yardstick or the benchmark, So, like what the Buddha says, watching the mind, is something that's very, very important. That's why it's important, when we, in our daily life, we practice this open mindfulness, you don't have to wait until a meditation retreat, but even when you are, working on your daily life, have this open mindfulness and be aware the sense objects that impinge on your sense base and watch your mind, how your mind reacts to it, whether there's loba, dosa, moha. The moment you have these defilements, the Buddha says you must quickly remove them like a lady seeing her face, in the clear bowl of water that there's a blemish or food residue on her mouth. She'll quickly want to remove it, right? It's the same as us. In the moment you see loba, dosa, moha arise, you must quickly remove it, just like this blemish on your face, and or like, for example, your turban is on fire, you must really remove it quickly, and and from there you see, is there any defilements, So watch the mind. That's why the Buddha says this kayagata sati, is a very, very powerful meditation, because you see how your mind reacts to sense objects. And if loba, dosa, moha arises in you, then you must use samatha vipassana and try to attain this letting go, this nibbida and viraga, to let go, and to see things that these defilements are basically non-self and empty. They are not me, but they are actually, they arise, due to causes and conditions, which are basically based on what I see or what I hear and the other sense bases. And so it's actually something that's not non-self. So the Buddha says, if you can practice that, the Buddha says, ignorance is given up, knowledge arises, and it leads to what? It leads to fruit of stream entry, once return, non-return, and arahantship. That is how powerful this kayagata sati is. But here they translate it as bodhila, but actually it's the mind. This kaya has different meanings, but here they put it as bodhila. So I just want to leave you with that, for you to understand, give you the guidance as to what constitutes, the Dhamma and what's not, the true teaching of the Buddha, so that, as we usher in the new year next week, if friends ask you, hey, what's the teaching of the Buddha, your Buddha, the Blessed One, is this correct, what others are practicing, then at least, you can explain, in this context, based on whether there's loba, dosa, moha, or whether it leads to disenchantment and whether it leads to dispassion.